Good morning and welcome to our Sasquatch special today. I'm Alyssa Yapel and I will be helping to moderate today along with my coworker Rochelle, who I'm going to pop on the screen for a second to wave hello. Rochelle's from Wingfoot State Park. She's a naturalist up there. And so Rochelle and I are going to be helping answer your questions or filter them to John, who is our presenter, and I'll pop John on the screen in just a minute, but I do want to point out the Q&A box. So if you have any questions today, please utilize the Q&A box. I do want to mention during John's presentation, he's going to start with the big picture. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Sasquatch or Bigfoot or the grassman, and John will get into all of that. So he's going to start with the big picture and start at the global level and talk about Native American traditions and then the modern stories of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever you want to call him, and then down to our state. So if you have questions that are more specific, maybe just hold on to them until we get later on in the program. But with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to John.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being interested in this today. So today we're talking about Sasquatch, and since this is I'm not going to get terribly spooky with the Sasquatch today, and it's not hard to do because Sasquatch isn't the spookiest of monsters. But as Alyssa said, we're going to start kind of global and work our way down to right down to Ohio and actually right down to Salt Fork, where I'm at. So we'll talk about some of those local traditions. We'll talk about some of the sightings and research. And as Alyssa mentioned, kind of hold on to any questions that might be specific until the end, and I'll try to answer them. I will also say that I am not a Sasquatch expert, but I'm friends with a lot of Sasquatch researchers, and I've tried to utilize them putting together this webinar. I've tried to utilize them, and hopefully I've done a good job of kind of encapsulating Sasquatch, and we'll kind of talk about Sasquatch, whether what the belief in Sasquatch is at the end, but. Right now, just to start, I've worked at Salt Fork since, well, I was here in 2012 and 2013, and then I've been here permanently since 2016. And I actually grew up in this park. I grew up 12 miles away, and it was right at my, it's my backyard. And I will start this webinar by saying I have never physically seen a Sasquatch, because that's probably 30% of my questions here at the Nature Center during the summer is, have you ever seen Sasquatch? So I've never seen a Bigfoot, but I've also never seen an ivory-billed woodpecker. So there are things that I haven't seen, and it doesn't mean that they don't exist. So we'll get started. Now, almost every culture has some sort of tradition regarding a Bigfoot-like creature. In China and other parts of Asia, you've got the Yeren.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm having trouble putting your PowerPoint up. Uh-oh. So I don't know if others can see it or not. Okay. But we are trying to get that figured out on our end. I don't know if you're able to start without it, but I just want to let you know.
I can start without it.
Okay.
Do you want me to stop sharing and try to restart sharing?
Yeah, that might work.
All right, we'll just try it again.
Sorry, folks.
Well, can you see it?
Let me see. I'm trying to, yep, there we go.
Are we good?
We are good.
Excellent.
Thank you.
In China and other parts of Asia, you have a creature called the Yeren, and it is it's actually usually characterized as kind of a more monkey-like animal. You can see in this picture in the bottom left, it's actually got an opposable thumb on its foot. But that is a tradition. The Yaran's a tradition of a kind of a forest-dwelling Bigfoot-like creature. In Indonesia, there's the orang pendek, and that's actually a small Bigfoot. It's kind of this hobbit-like Bigfoot, this small creature. And something that's really fascinating about this is there's this oral tradition of the orang pendek in Indonesia, but in Indonesia they also have found a species of human called Homo floresiensis, and it was a small human that actually lived alongside it. Our time periods overlapped, and it was kind of this small human. So the idea is that there's probably the tradition of the orang pendek is actually probably this species of early human, because our time periods overlapped. There was probably an oral tradition early on that just carried on into modern times, which is pretty fascinating. And that picture of a skull, of the skulls there, that's actually a comparison in size of a modern human skull to the other species. So that's an interesting thing, to me at least. Then we have in Tibet and Nepal and Russia, you have the tradition of the Yeti. That is it's the abominable snowman. And actually the term abominable snowman is, that was applied to Bigfoot in North America clear up until the 1950s, because the name Bigfoot didn't come along until then. So there was this tradition of the abominable snowman, and people actually did expeditions through, into the Himalayas, like to try to find the abominable snowman. So the closest thing that people could call a Bigfoot in North America was, an abominable snowman or a Yeti. So that's kind of fascinating. You've got this big white sort of mountain gorilla, and there's a long tradition there. And then in Australia, of all places, you have the yowie, which is this sort of hairy creature. And the yowie is actually one of the scarier Bigfoots. So we're not going to spend too much time on it, but it's certainly not like it's not, a benevolent forest dweller. It's kind of a scarier Bigfoot. And you can see that it's got claws and fangs in that picture of it holding a kangaroo. So that's kind of on the global traditions of Bigfoot. And these are very broad strokes of the global traditions. Almost every continent has its own tradition of Bigfoot or something like Bigfoot. Here in North America, many Native American cultures have lore and stories regarding forest giants and wild people and things like that. And the interesting thing to me is the difference between those legends and our modern mythology or our modern legends about Bigfoot. Now Bigfoot is more or less he's not harmful or helpful. He's just kind of a neutral being that people see on accident while they're hiking, and there's not this scary element. In the Native American traditions, there seemed to be kind of a dichotomy of Bigfoot. So there was sort of a protecting spirit, forest spirit, that watched over the forest and watched over a specific tribe, and that was a Bigfoot. Or there was also like the sort of scary cannibalistic Bigfoot that would, with people disappeared, that was often attributed to that. So there are many different names, and there are actually place names now. Like the first name there, this is the Skookum. There are places like Skookum Falls and Skookum Prairie. That was a kind of a Pacific Northwest term. Those tribes up there. So and the interesting thing is there's a lot of art regarding kind of a large forest giant. So there's the Skookum, there's Sasquatch, which is, if you see in the middle there, there's sort of a mask with pursed lips. This was a wild woman of the woods. She's often depicted with pursed lips because legend has it that she was whistling. You would hear whistling and she would frequently kidnap children. So there's probably an element of the cautionary tale with that legend, where like don't go climbing on the side of a cliff because this wild woman might catch you, rather than saying don't go climbing on the side of a cliff because you might fall. But she was often depicted as whistling and depicted carrying a bag with a child in it, which is kind of interesting. Then you have the Sasquatch. Sasquatch is actually kind of it's a Native American name that came about, and the Wendigo. The Wendigo is an interesting thing because it's kind of a Bigfoot and kind of not a Bigfoot, and it's kind of the spookier of all of these, because it is sort of the scary cannibalistic Bigfoot that has been known to eat people. So. But this is just kind of a broad look at some of the Native American traditions, and there's a lot of art depicting these sort of forest giants, a lot of pre-Columbian art and pre-Columbian traditions regarding these forest giants. So it's been around since before Europeans made it to North America. But moving past that, we've got kind of the era of the modern Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot, as I said before, the name Bigfoot or Sasquatch didn't really come about until much, much later on, back in the 50s. But if you look back through newspaper articles and things like that, and there's actually a really great book called I think it's called The Historical Bigfoot or The Historical Sasquatch, that kind of goes back and tries to parse out what people were talking about in newspaper articles, whether they were talking about something that was a Bigfoot or something paranormal or something else. But the term Bigfoot didn't come along until the 50s. However, you saw a lot of newspaper articles that would say wild man or hairy man or escaped ape from circus. That seems to be, there's a whole running theory. Whenever anybody saw a Bigfoot, a lot of times it would be reported as, an orangutan or a gorilla escaped from a traveling circus, and that's what they saw. So you'll also see them called devils. So there's this idea that places like Devil's Canyon, things like that, were named because of Bigfoot activity. People would call them these forest devils. So kind of ushering in the modern Bigfoot is something called the Bowman incident. And I mention this because this was actually written in a book by a former president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Wrote about this in The Wilderness Hunter, a collection of frontier tales that he had assembled during his hunting adventures. And he had actually spoke to this guy, Bowman, and Bowman was a trapper in the mid 1800s, the mid 19th century. He was a trapper, and his Bigfoot experience is a little different than most of the others that we're going to be talking about today. He and a partner were out trapping, and they'd gone out setting traps and split up. And he came back to a ransacked camp, and his partner was deceased. And had looked like it had been attacked by a large animal. And Bowman recounted how he had seen a creature that kind of fits the idea of a modern Bigfoot and had been stalked by a creature that fits the idea of the modern Bigfoot. So it's an interesting story, and I mention it not because it's scary, but because it was it was recounted by Theodore Roosevelt. So it seems at least like a trustworthy source to me, and it is kind of an interesting bit of folklore. Next, I have the Ape Canyon incident, which is pretty interesting. Some prospectors were living in a cabin in Washington. Now, the Bowman incident happened in Montana. Ape Canyon incident, it happened in Washington State. We don't quite know for sure where the cabin is. We think we've got, some researchers think they know where it's at, but it doesn't really exist anymore. And it was kind of this ramshackle hut. It wasn't this big log cabin. But these prospectors had they told this story about how returning from being out in the field one night, they encountered a group of animals that began throwing rocks and shaking the cabin. They began throwing rocks onto the roof of the cabin, and large rocks, like boulder-sized rocks, causing some damage to the cabin. And the prospectors actually left. They left and never returned. And it's interesting. One researcher found a land claim information for a mining claim that had the miner, like these miners, it was the right time, it was the right number of miners, and the claim that they were working was a functioning claim. It was producing things. So for them to just up and leave without their mine kind of pinching out, is kind of interesting. Something had to happen for all 4 miners to kind of up and leave a functioning claim. The next is kind of a humorous story. It's the Osman encounter. Now, Osman was he was an outdoorsman, and in 1924 he claimed to have actually been kidnapped by a Bigfoot and held for 6 days at their camp. And he had a rucksack with all of his with his essentials, all of his camping gear and food and things in it, and he was kind of picked up by a Bigfoot and taken to a camp with other he referred to them as the mother Bigfoot and the old man Bigfoot and some younger Bigfoots, and he claimed to have been held for 6 days, and finally escaped by offering the Bigfoot's snuff. He had a can of snuff, and it made them sneeze. And they were able to be distracted long enough for him to escape, which is kind of interesting to me. And then now, really, kind of the quintessential modern Bigfoot experience. And this is actually when the term Bigfoot came into existence. This is a series of large footprints were found in Northern California around a construction site, and oil drums were moved around and things were shuffled around. And this fellow named Jerry Crew found these large footprints, and the newspaper article refers to them as big space foot. There's a big foot found at construction site with a space in the middle, but very shortly after, it became the name of the creature. It became Bigfoot. That was the name of it. And here's a picture of this. Here's a picture of this big footprint. And then moving on from that, in 1967, we have the famous Patterson-Gimlin footage, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the Bigfoot evidence. But this is the famous footage from 1967. And by far the most compelling evidence that we have of a creature, because this, you can see this on any documentary about Bigfoot, anything like that. It's kind of a hard fake. If it is a fake, it's kind of hard to fake something so anatomically correct with muscles and things like that move, and the gait of the animal, and it's an interesting piece of footage. And she is this particular creature has been referred to as Patty, like the Patterson-Gimlin footage. So she's referred to as Patty. So whenever you see that sort of walking Bigfoot, that is Patty. And I mention this because if I'm doing a nature hike here, and I've got a dozen people, and I ask a dozen people to draw me a bear, I'm going to get 12 different bears. I'll get scary bears and cute bears and round, poorly drawn bears, and I'll get 12 different bears. If I've got a nature hike and I have a dozen people and I ask them to draw me a Bigfoot, I'll probably get 11 Patties. This is what people think of when they think of Bigfoot, is this animal right here. And this is Patterson. He's just a fantastic guy. He and Gimlin were the ones that shot this footage. He's been to the Salt Fork Salt Fork Bigfoot Conference, the Ohio Bigfoot Conference that we host here. He's kind of this rugged old cowboy, and he's got this great voice. And I have a picture of him up there because I like to mention him because Bigfoot to him, if this is a fake, it kind of ruined everything. Bigfoot to him, I mean, he's not raking in money because of Bigfoot. He gets harassed about it. He's gotten harassed. He's lost jobs. It's kind of it's damaged his reputation, and he's stuck to his guns and said this thing. We took footage of this animal. So that I have this picture up there because if it is a hoax, it certainly didn't play in his favor, and he has stuck to it this whole time. And he'll say like this. I've got people that have vandalized my property, and I've lost jobs, and I can't apply for loans and things like that because for a long time he was viewed as this kind of crackpot. But he's just fantastic to listen to. If you ever YouTube any of his videos, he's fantastic to listen to because he's kind of this folksy old cowboy, that happened to see this animal. So moving on. So we also have here in North America, we have a tradition of kind of regional monsters, and that includes Momo in Missouri, which is the kind of the Missouri Bigfoot. And we have the Fouke monster, which was the star of a great film in the 1970s called The Legend of Boggy Creek. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a great film, even if you're not a Bigfooter. It's kind of a mockumentary. It was sort of the first sort of scary movie that was shot like a documentary. And it recounts the story of the Fouke monster, the Boggy Creek monster, in a place called Fouke, Arkansas, in Texarkana. And it was the sort of swamp monster that roamed the fields and river bottoms in Boggy Creek area around Fouke, and would steal livestock and things like that. So a really interesting regional monster. Then you have the Honey Island swamp monster, in the swamps down there also. And in Florida and some of the other southern states, you have the skunk ape. Now this photo of the skunk ape that I put up there is allegedly a real photo. It's kind of an interesting photo. If it's real, it's very interesting. But there's a lot of discussion as to whether it's real or not. But I mentioned the skunk ape because the skunk ape is called the skunk ape because of the foul smell, and that's something that we'll see with Bigfoot encounters all the way through, is that they're often punctuated by this terrible smell. If there's a Sasquatch or some creature like that around, almost all accounts say that it smells terrible. And that is one thing during the Bigfoot hikes that we do out here at Salt Fork, which I'll talk a little bit about experiences that we've had with that. But there was one Bigfoot hike in particular where we walked into an area and it really just did smell like hot garbage, which is the only time that's happened during a Bigfoot hike. So that was kind of interesting. But we have there is this idea that, and if you think about it, it's actually probably a pretty good idea. An animal, an 800-pound, 8-foot tall animal with thick, coarse hair all over its body probably doesn't smell fresh. I mean, a bear, if you're ever close enough to a bear to smell it, they don't smell great. So it is interesting. Often people smell a Bigfoot before they see it, and that's often reported. So a note on some of these animals in particular. I mention these because it is fascinating to me. These animals are kind of all in the swamps and along the Mississippi and those areas. And often, in the case of Momo and the Fouke monster and the Honey Island swamp monster and the skunk ape, often footprints that are taken and trackways that are discovered are these strange, long, three-toed footprints instead of the classic Bigfoot footprint, which is basically an extra large humanoid footprint. You've got these strange three-toed footprints. So, this kind of lends to the idea of some sort of speciation, maybe the swamp species of Bigfoot, the species of Bigfoot that inhabits those areas along the Mississippi and in the southern swamplands, kind of evolved to have three toes rather than a five-digit foot. So it's interesting to me that we have this unique thing that's pretty consistent in those areas, while the sort of eastern Bigfoot that we have, in Ohio and even in the northern Pacific and Canadian Bigfoot, they all have these kind of five-toed footprints. So that's kind of interesting to me from a naturalist standpoint. Like if you're looking at it, if we're looking at it, which that's how I approach this, is that it's a flesh and blood, honest to goodness animal. From a natural standpoint, if it is a flesh and blood animal and it's been here long enough, there's probably species and subspecies of it. So you would expect some variation between species. So that's always fascinated me. Let's see. All right, at this point, let's see. Do we want to, are there any interesting questions, Alyssa? Here, this is kind of the middle of the PowerPoint, so
we do have some questions that we can touch on. Some of them are relating to Ohio, so I might hold those ones since I know you're getting into that soon. But let's see, we did have a question about which one. So you were talking about the Native American tradition and Bigfoot, and we had Colin who asked which ones were prehistoric Indian Bigfoot. I don't know if you can elaborate on that, John.
Oh, I can't elaborate on that because unfortunately, when it comes to like when it comes to things like the Clovis culture, some of the really early Native Americans, we really only know they existed because of flint points. And butchering sites of like mastodons and things like that. They left no art. I think there have been some beads found, some hollow beads that may have also been fishing weights. We don't know, but they left no art. They're not quite like they're not like the Hopewell, Adena cultures or where there were effigy pipes and things like that left behind. So as far as I know, some of the real like prehistoric artwork or prehistoric Bigfoots, if there was anything depicting them, we don't have it. I will say kind of the running theory is when the prehistoric people came to North America for the first time, and again, we're looking at, it could be 15,000 years ago, a really long time. When the prehistoric people first came to North America across the land bridge from Asia, that it's kind of the running theory is that something close to, say, the Yeti or the Yeren, something like that, actually came with them. Not necessarily traveling with them, but followed the same course, the land bridge, over and kind of populated North America with a Bigfoot right alongside us populating North America with man. So with humans. It's kind of interesting, that theory, but if they were immortalized in any sort of tradition that way, we don't know, because there's virtually no art regarding those sort of that early of human habitation in North America. However, there's a lot of pre-Columbian art, so pre-discovery of the New World. There's a lot of pre-Columbian art, and that was some of those masks and cave drawings and statues that I had on that slide depicts some of those pre-Columbian art. I am not familiar with, say, prehistoric cultures in like southern France or Spain where there were Neanderthals and modern humans living alongside each other, and there's some cave art there. I'm not familiar with anything depicting Bigfoot, but also I'm not first of all, I'm not an anthropologist, and I'm also not an expert on Bigfoot. I just work kind of at the Bigfoot capital of Ohio. Here, so if that exists, I might just not be aware of it. But as far as North America goes, we really only know that the earliest people in North America, we only know they existed because of flint points they left behind and tools they left behind and their campsites and things like that. We don't really have. There's not a lot of good art and it's probably because those earliest inhabitants didn't have quite the rich religion that later Native Americans had. They probably had a much more primitive, much more sort of nature cyclical based religion, but we don't know. That's all speculation. So I hope that helps. As far as I know, there's not a good prehistoric Bigfoot.
Yeah, and we had somebody Jeremy wrote in about have there ever been any DNA type of evidence for an unidentifiable creature? I don't know if you're going to get into evidence, John.
Yeah, I am going to get into the evidence.
Okay.
I will say that it's hard because it's when it comes to DNA, there's a lot of evidence that was deemed inconclusive, which we'll talk about. But if there's no baseline to compare it to, an inconclusive test is kind of interesting. So yeah, we'll get into that when we get into evidence. But yes, there's been hair and scat and things like that collected, and some of that has been deemed inconclusive. So it is interesting. Some of it is just misidentified bear hair or deer hair or things like that. But some of it is kind of fascinating to find out. But we will get into that when we get into the evidence.
Okay.
So I've got two. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just ask one more and then we can move on. There's still some other questions, but they're kind of more specific, so we'll come back to them. But Blaine had asked, what kind of climates can Bigfoots be found? So as we move away from global.
Yeah. So that's interesting. It seems like, at least in North America, since we're looking at global first, so a lot of the traditions in Asia, you have it in heavily forested areas that are not unlike the Pacific Northwest or the eastern forests here. In the case of like the orang pendek, you have a jungle species, but there's surprisingly few sightings in desert areas. Now, if you take a look at this map with the red on it, you can kind of see with the exception of California, there aren't a ton of sightings in the desert portions of North America, and it's probably because if you're covered in hair, it's kind of hard to survive if you're covered in that much hair, it's kind of hard to survive in Death Valley. It seems to be that the Sasquatch creature is very well adapted for temperate or cooler climates, like we have here in Ohio and like in the Northwest, or those heavily forested sort of tropical or subtropical climates like the southern swamps and the jungles in Indonesia. But it seems like the desert areas are kind of lacking as far as that goes. As well as like the Great Plains in North America don't have quite as many sightings. So just a quick map here of Ohio. And a lot of these maps came from the actual BFRO website, which is a great website. We'll talk about it a little bit more with the research and the evidence and our resources for Bigfoot research. But this kind of shows the concentrations of Ohio Bigfoot sightings, and Guernsey County is right up there in the top. Usually, Guernsey, Coshocton, Portage, those are all kind of usually up there in the top of the top end of Bigfoot sightings. Kind of the more rugged parts of Ohio tend to get a lot of Bigfoot sightings down in Adams and Scioto County and Athens County, those areas. So the really heavily forested areas, and you can kind of see. It would be interesting if I should have done this if we took like a forest density map of Ohio and kind of superimposed it on this. I bet there would be a lot of overlap between the densest parts of the forests and our sightings of Bigfoot. So the Ohio grassman. So a note on that name. the Ohio grassman, there's some misinformation out there about it, that it was kind of a Native American tradition that was translated into the Ohio grassman. But from what the Bigfoot researchers that I talk to and work with have found, we can narrow it down to an article that appeared early in the 20th century in the Akron Beacon Journal. There were these large animals that were spotted, and they found these sort of nests made out of tall grass, and the term grassman was kind of coined from that. There's a story that outside or behind the I think it was the DuPont factory. There was kind of a field between a railroad bed and the factory, and people were seeing these. They called them hobos, but when it was investigated, if it were a person, it would have to be an 8-foot tall person to be noticed above all of the grass, and that's kind of one of the areas where that term grassman came from. And it's a confusing term because you hear the Ohio grassman, you kind of picture this green, swamp thing looking animal, when in fact it refers to something like the Sasquatch. So in Ohio, we have a long tradition of the sort of wild men, forest giants, escaped apes and gorillas, much like you see throughout North America, that date back to the early settlement of the region. And there are also pre-Columbian legends, like I talked about in North America in general. There are these pre-Columbian legends about giants and these hairy forest dwellers that are common in the Iroquois tradition, the Erie tradition, the Delaware and Shawnee traditions all have legends about kind of these hairy, forest beings. But in a more modern instance, there's an interesting an interesting encounter that happened in Gallipolis in 1869. And it was written up in several papers. It was actually one of the articles that you can find is actually in a Minnesota paper regarding this incident in Ohio, in Southeast Ohio. But a father and a daughter were in a horse-drawn carriage on a country road, and an animal actually attacked the carriage and attacked the driver of the carriage, the father, and had the man and I believe it was called a grip like a vice on the ground, when the daughter picked up rocks off the road and started pelting the animal with rocks and managed to scare it away. And later on, a posse was formed to go out and try to find this wild man, because again, the term Bigfoot didn't exist. These folks didn't know about any traditions about Sasquatch or anything like that. So it was thought that this was a feral human, someone that kind of went off the grid and lived in the woods. They were this unkempt human that was attacking people at random on the road. And we don't know because we weren't there. We don't know whether that was the case. But their searches never resulted in actually capturing anything. And then later on, we got the Minerva monster, which is kind of right up there with the Salt Fork grassman as far as the fame that it's reached. The Minerva monster was spotted in 1978, and this creature. It started with sort of one family saw the Minerva monster behind their house, and then multiple people have seen it. And there's an excellent, there's quite a lot of good resources regarding the Minerva monster. But this sighting, the sighting of the Minerva monster was common enough that people were, it was not a surprise when the kids would get up in the morning to eat breakfast and there would be creatures in their backyard. Like, it became so common that they were seeing these things on their farm, that it was just not a surprise anymore. So the Minerva monster is one of our state's most fascinating Sasquatch encounters. Now, many of our reports come from state parks, state forests, wildlife areas, nature preserves here in Ohio. So a lot of the Bigfoot reports come from public land that we're using every day. And you know, it's not uncommon to see unusual things that have slowly made their way into our natural areas. We just have recently started seeing a lot more otters here at Salt Fork, which is pretty fascinating. Otters and bobcats here at Salt Fork. You know, and if you came here 10 years ago, we weren't seeing as many of those creatures. So so it makes sense, you know, as the forests mature and as our forests in Ohio expand, because we're lucky in the state to have such expansive public areas and wildlands here, that as those expand and mature, that, you know, other creatures would kind of start utilizing them, creatures that aren't just humans. So moving on, maybe. All right, Salt Fork grassman. So I tried to keep reports directly from the BFRO database here. I will say, though, an oral tradition of Bigfoot sightings has existed here for quite some time, and there are reports from former employees dating back from the the early 80s even of Sasquatch encounters. So, but starting with some of the more, in my opinion, the more interesting Bigfoot encounters at Salt Fork. In 2010, there were some teenagers night fishing here at the park. They were fishing for catfish, and described, you know, bowling ball sized pieces of sandstone being thrown or rolled down the hill at them, and some possible vocalizations. And they were, if you read the report, they really did sound very shaken from this. Now, when I say this rock throwing behavior, it's maybe not necessarily a violent gesture. It's most likely a sort of territorial behavior, and we see that with a lot of the great apes. You see territorial behavior like throwing rocks and sticks and vocalizing with a lot of great apes. And when we talk about evidence and vocalizations and things like that, you'll hear me refer to things like wood knocks. That's also not an uncommon behavior among great apes, is like taking a stick and banging it on a tree to make noise. And that's one of the things that it is theorized that Bigfoot does as a form of communication, or these sort of wood knocks, where they'll make these noises, whether they're actually banging on a tree or whether it's a form of vocalization that to our ear just sounds like they're banging on a tree. That's kind of one of their behaviors, and it might not be anything violent. It might actually be a sort of form of communication, kind of, hey, who are you? This is my area. Respond now before we have an encounter. And then in May 2013, two creatures were observed on a ridgeline. A gentleman was going to meet his friends to go fishing, and he saw what he thought were his friends walking up a hillside, and he kind of said, hey, I'm over here, wait up. And these two creatures turned around and took a look at him, and he quickly realized that they were not his friends. This is one of our best sightings here at Salt Fork. This is kind of one of our, it was on one of our kind of Bigfoot hotspots, the Shadbush Trail, which is a beautiful trail here, but also a trail that has had a lot of activity. So this is one of our more interesting sightings here, because it was substantiated. The guy kind of had a really great description of these animals. In June 2013, in our primitive campsite, a couple flee their campsite after a possible encounter. This encounter included some sort of like stalking, where they heard things outside of their tent, and it seemed to them, they were pretty convinced that something was sort of scoping out their tent, but I do emphasize possible encounter here because you know, it is hard when you're in a tent. I mean, a raccoon can really sound an awful lot like a bear if you're in your tent and you're already kind of freaked out. So this was an interesting encounter, and we don't know, but you know, this was in our primitive campgrounds here. And then in February 2017, this is a report taken by actually one of my good friends. This is a lodge employee had a possible sighting with a footprint casting near Hosak's Cave, driving to work near Hosak's Cave. So this is definitely one of our more interesting, the way it was described in the report. This animal, you know, it was really under circumstances where it could not have been a bear, could not have been, you know, a deer or a person. It really was like the person that had the sighting really didn't know how else to explain it other than a Bigfoot. So it's a very interesting sighting. We have many more sightings, but these are just kind of the most, to me, the most interesting and most fascinating ones and the most compelling ones here at Salt Fork. So these photos that I'm pulling up, these are casts that were actually taken. Most of them were actually taken by one of our Bigfoot researchers here at Salt Fork that works with us a lot, Dave Wickham, and he takes a lot of reports when he takes a lot of reports when someone has an encounter, and he's pretty good at casting. This plaster casting of footprints is an art form. It is surprisingly difficult. It's really more than just mixing up some plaster and dumping it into a track. It's really difficult. If you ever want to try it on a deer print sometime. It's really pretty difficult to get a great footprint. So some of these, you know, it's almost the fact that they are not, you know, perfect, well-defined footprints to me that make them less of a chance of being a hoax than some other footprints that I see. The fact that they are kind of like, you know, footprint shaped casts, to me, it seems like that's a lot more accurate to me than these sort of well-defined with toe pads and ridges and things like that, because it is really hard. And he's very, very good at it. If you ever want to know how to cast footprints, talk to Dave, because he's really good at it. This footprint down in the bottom right in the glass case there, that's a footprint that was taken back kind of in the campground area, in the Shadbush Trail area, and that's kind of our best Salt Fork big footprint that I think that we have, and that's actually a replica of the original. And one of the guys from Finding Bigfoot donated that to the Nature Center here. Cliff Brockman donated that replica of the original footprint here. Now I have some non-footprint photos up there. You can see this twisted tree branch. This tree branch, to my knowledge, was pretty high off the ground and twisted in a way that was maybe not necessarily natural. You know, that's definitely something that wouldn't happen just if even if like an animal, say a black bear, were trying to do it. This is kind of an interesting picture. And then in the bottom left, there's a picture of a stick structure that could be a possible shelter. Now, a note with these possible actual constructed shelters, part of the reason why the grassman is called the grassman is because these sort of grass huts were discovered, these grass nests were discovered, and it was theorized that they could be birthing shelters. It could be an area where these animals go to have birth, or to give birth. And it was kind of an Ohio thing for the longest time. And there's a there's now a program called the Olympic Project in the Pacific Northwest, and nests have been discovered there that are distinctly different, but certainly have shades of the things that are discovered here in Ohio, as far as how they're constructed, how sticks are woven together, and things like that. So it's fascinating to me that, you know, we've got something in the Pacific Northwest and something here in Ohio that are very similar and found in similar areas as far as the terrain. And the theory is that these might not be their daily shelters where they kind of bed down at night, but these might be specific to, say, the breeding season when they're about to have young. They might be specially constructed shelters that are only used for that. So these are interesting. You'll hear these in some of the Bigfoot literature. You'll hear them referred to as stick stacks or stick shelters. These kind of teepee-like shelters. And I've actually seen some of the alleged stick shelters, and they certainly look. If you look at them close enough, they're woven together pretty delicately. They're not just randomly piled together. So, all right. So some evidence. We've got footprints, and a note on footprints. A lot of the Bigfoot footprints that are kind of classified as real and not hoaxed have an interesting anatomical feature called a mid-tarsal break that Dr. Jeff Meldrum hypothesizes that makes it's like the hardest evidence is that mid-tarsal break, and it's kind of the lack of an arch and the way the footprints are the way the footprints are laid out in the ground. It's this, they refer to it as this mid-tarsal break in the middle of the foot. And it's interesting, we do not have a mid-tarsal break. These footprints do, and it's kind of an interesting, if the form of locomotion would make sense for a creature that size, walking around barefoot with those big of feet, to have this mid-tarsal break. So anatomically speaking, it would really make a lot of sense from an evolution standpoint to have that mid-tarsal break. And footprints are by far the sort of the hardest, most compelling evidence that we have. Hair, we talked about hair a little bit. Hair samples are found much less often, and they're very often unidentified or misidentified. However, the DNA studies that are done on hair very often come back inconclusive. Scat, like hair, it's often misidentified. There's a running theory that the reason why we don't find too much Bigfoot scat out there is because Bigfoot prefers to use the bathroom and running water. And there are lots of reports of folks seeing a Bigfoot next to a creek, squatting next to a creek, or squatting in a creek, and they're under the impression that they were actually using the bathroom and they interrupted them. So that's the kind of the one of the reasons why we may not find, you know, Bigfoot scat, is because they prefer to, you know, they prefer to evacuate in running water. And then there are recordings and vocalizations, which are also very compelling. I'm especially fond of some of the vocalizations myself. And then photographs and videos. Lots of photographs and videos exist. And we'll talk about, I'm going to delve into that a little bit here closer to the end. But let's move on with some footprints.
Hey, John, can I ask you a question about hair?
Absolutely.
Isaac had asked, have there been trails of hair that have been found, or is it just like, you know, an individual clump of hair here or there?
Oh, well, yeah, there are, as far as trails go, there's hair that is found in those nesting sites. And then there's also hair that, just like with any other animal, you know, crossing a barbed wire fence in the middle of a field or on the edge of a field, it leaves some hair behind. I don't know of any reports. And again, I'm not an expert, so I don't have a photographic memory of every Bigfoot report. But I don't know of any instance where it was like an animal was leaving behind, you know, an animal was possibly shedding and leaving behind like a trail of hair. But there's certainly a lot of the circumstances under which a lot of the hair is found is things that you would imagine deer are leaving hair behind, you know, rubbing up against a tree branch, rubbing up against briars. They're certainly under natural circumstances. I do not know if there has ever been a case where there's just been like a trail of hair left behind. But oftentimes, hair is found in areas where there are trackways, and they're found in areas that you would predict, things like on a briar plant, caught on thorns, caught on barbed wire fences, kind of in the middle of a trackway. And when I say a trackway, I mean a series of footprints. We have this kind of misconception that there's always just like one or two footprints, but oftentimes the casts that you find with footprints, they're kind of the best examples that were found as part of a trackway. They're not just one random footprint that they found in the middle of a field and then Bigfoot disappeared. It's often, kind of the best examples. Oh, we can get a good cast of these two footprints here in the soft soil, and it's often associated with a trackway, an actual kind of a game trail. But yeah, as to my knowledge, I don't know about a trail of hair, but that's something that I'm sure maybe I could find for you later on. Any other questions before we move on, or are we good?
We can move on. That was just
okay.
Specific to that slide, so I thought I'd ask it.
Excellent. Well, thanks. So footprints are certainly the most compelling. You have you've got examples like the original, the Jerry Crew, the Bluff Creek footprint up in the left here. Then if you see the one that's next to the ice axe down there in the snow, that's actually a Yeti footprint. That's an alleged Yeti footprint. And it's fascinating that the Yeti footprint actually has sort of, you can see it's got sort of an opposable thumb. Its big toe isn't quite right. It's not quite in line with the rest of them. But I want to draw your attention to these two tracks kind of in the middle and the left of the screen here. These are famous tracks that are referred to as the cripplefoot tracks, because you'll notice that the left footprint is the toes are crooked and the foot's kind of turned in. Looks like it's been injured or it has some sort of congenital defect. And to me, this footprint is very compelling because why on earth would you hoax a something like that? Like why, it seems like that would take an awful lot of forethought to think I'm going to hoax this, this creature with a broken foot, So this one to me is very compelling. That idea, the cripplefoot tracks, and I didn't coin that. That's Grover Krantz is was a physical anthropologist. He's the one that coined that term. These tracks though are just fascinating. You can see there's like broken toes and toes turned in, and it seems strange that that would be hoax. But speaking of hoaxes, you can see kind of the classic wooden footprints stapled to a boot. And you can, in fact, hoax Bigfoot footprints with wooden, carved wooden feet stapled to a boot. However, the thing that you end up missing is that the mid-tarsal break that we talked about, that kind of mid-tarsal bend in the foot. Those are not apparent in the wooden hoaxed tracks. And skilled researchers, the ones that I know, can identify these fake footprints pretty readily. So moving on, hair and scat. Here are some examples of hair and scat. This example up in the upper left that kind of looks like a photocopy of hair. That's actually from some hair that was sent to the FBI. Which is kind of fascinating that someone tried to get the FBI involved. A Bigfoot researcher named Peter Byrne tried very hard to get the FBI to actually try to identify this hair and open up an investigation about Bigfoot. We mentioned DNA. Much of the hair and scat that is found is deemed inconclusive when DNA tests are done on it. It's either deemed inconclusive or it turns out to be a bear. So it is interesting to me that we haven't found, some physical DNA evidence. But it's an evolving science, and it's one of those things that as technology and science evolves, so our ability to identify things like this might also involve. The idea of environmental DNA is very fascinating, and that's kind of a new science. Environmental DNA is not from like a drop of blood. It's DNA that is found in an area that's been inhabited by animals, and it's kind of an inherently part of the environment. So DNA that they can find in dirt from animals that have been there in the past. So that idea of like environmental DNA that's just found in the substrate of the forest floor or in the water. You know, you take a water sample and you can get an idea of what species live in the water by that environmental DNA. Those DNA fragments that are apparent in the water and in an environment where an animal lives. So that's also, it's kind of an evolving science, and really the Olympic project that I mentioned earlier is pretty involved in trying to get those get the environmental DNA of areas that are kind of Bigfoot hotspots, finding places where, you know, they think Bigfoot lives daily, and trying to find, you know, fragments of their DNA just floating around in the environment. So we'll move on. All right, so real quick, I've got some vocalizations here, and hopefully they work. This one is by far the most famous vocalization from Ohio. This is the Ohio Howl. This was recorded in Columbiana County. So we're going to listen to it really quick. Sorry, they were all playing at once. So that Ohio howl, that's kind of the quintessential Bigfoot howl, that sort of long, mournful howl. And that was recorded right here in Ohio, and it's certainly a compelling piece of vocalization. I don't know of a native creature that sounds quite like that. And you can hear some dogs barking in the background, but that's certainly a compelling piece of information, or a piece of soundbite, a compelling soundbite there. One of the other, I'm going to skip the whoop here, but this other one is kind of fascinating. The Sierra Samurai was recorded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, or the Sierra Mountains there. And it's kind of an interesting, this sort of chattering, an unnatural chattering that you hear. We'll play it really quick if I can. So kind of a fascinating sound clip of this kind of unnatural chattering, and that one would also lend to that idea of speciation, where, you know, like Bigfoot in the high Sierras would probably sound different than one found in southeastern Ohio. So pretty fascinating sound clips there. So moving on, some photographs and videos. I mentioned Patty. She's by far the most compelling piece of video evidence. That Patterson-Gimlin footage, like, that's, you know, it's like 1.2 minutes long or something. You know, it's not very long at all, but it's a great short film that is certainly compelling. And again, kind of your quintessential Bigfoot. We have that picture of the skunk ape that I mentioned that may or may not be, you know, hoaxed. And then over here in the right-hand side of the page, you have this Bigfoot that was allegedly caught on a traffic camera on a snowy highway in Washington. So we have photographs. Now, it's always mentioned to me, how come Bigfoot is always blurry in a photograph? And it is true. I mean, we can take really high-definition photos of our of things with our phones now. However, I would imagine that should I see an animal like Bigfoot, because like I said, I've never seen one. Should I see one, I'm probably not going to take the steadiest picture, because I'm going to be so freaked out that I just saw something as crazy as a Bigfoot that I'm probably not going to take the steadiest picture. So far be it from me to judge people's photographic skills when it comes to photographing things like this. One thing I do want to mention is a phenomenon called pareidolia, and this is our ability to see patterns out in the environment that maybe don't mean anything. And this is actually, it's a survival mechanism for us. We had to see predators before they saw us. So if we could pick out the shape of a tiger in the woods before it picked out us, we would survive. But we've gotten pretty darn good at seeing patterns, so we can see shapes in almost anything. You can see Elvis's face in French toast. An example of this, again, this is a photo that was sent to me by my friend Dave. This is a picture of, is it a Bigfoot face? Is it the body and kind of upper torso of a Bigfoot, or is it a shadow that our eyes are naturally drawn to that shape? We don't know. Is this an instance of pareidolia? We don't know. We have you can see, like, especially after you see the second photograph, it really kind of pops in the first photograph. You can really see it. So our eyes are just really great at seeing patterns. So there's certainly an element of that when looking into Bigfoot encounters. So there are lots of alternative theories to Bigfoot. We've been running this whole talk. We've been running on mostly the idea that it's a flesh and blood animal. But there's a whole line of thinking that Bigfoot is actually extraterrestrial and picked up and dropped off by UFOs. And if you can somehow, track both UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings in a given area, there's a lot of overlap there, which is interesting. And it does raise some questions. There are certainly Bigfoot encounters where people report things like lost time and disorientation. And a lot of like high strangeness surrounding their encounter. They woke up kind of in their car a couple hours after they saw this creature, and they don't know how they got there. Definitely, that's definitely a theory. Interdimensional Sasquatches, the idea that there are thin spots between dimensions, and that's why we can't capture one of these animals or find a body, is because they're actually interdimensional beings. Paranormal Bigfoot. The idea that they're actually ghosts and non-entities. They're not real, physical flesh and blood animals. And psychic Bigfoot. There's actually a whole kind of subculture within the Bigfoot community of the idea that Bigfoot is psychic, can communicate with you psychically, and you have to kind of be sensitive and open to it in order to see a Bigfoot, and that's why a vast majority of us do not. These are all theories, and like I said, I'm giving broad strokes, but I'm also trying to give a nod to all of the wonderful community that's out there. So I wanted to mention these.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could get through some questions. We're a little bit over time, so I thought maybe if we can do some questions in case people have to run, and then maybe we could come back absolutely. To the slides you have left if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we had a question come in from Will. There were a lot of Ohio specific questions.
Okay.
So he asked, are there any Bigfoot type legends among Native American tribes that lived in Ohio, such as the Shawnee or the Delaware? So I don't know, I know you touched on Native American traditions earlier, but are there any specific to Ohio that you could elaborate on?
Yeah. The Delaware and Shawnee both had a forest giant myth. And the Iroquois, which were in at least the Great Lakes region and parts of Ohio, the Iroquois had a pretty rich history of a forest giant. And there's actually art depicting, a forest giant that would capture and eat the Iroquois if they were caught. So yes, in Ohio we do have a good tradition, just as much as the Pacific Northwest, as far as having these forest giants kind of having a Bigfoot creature. So yeah, it is Ohio specific also. Okay.
And now I know you're not going to be aware of every single location. There may have been a Bigfoot sighting, but this is close to Salt Fork. So I'm going to ask, Linda had asked if there are any sightings that you're aware of in Barnesville. So just a little southeast from where Salt Fork is, I believe.
Right. Yeah. So that, as far as what I am aware of, no. However, if I'm going to switch slides here real quick. If you go to bfro.net, there's actually an interactive database where you can pick your county and see the sightings that were found like in your area. So you can go there, find out the Ohio section of that, and that's a great resource that BFRO, the BFRO research organization, their website has a great interactive database that you can go find, and it's kept up to date. It's a very well maintained website. So I'm sorry I can't specifically bring to mind anything in Barnesville, but if there's one there, you can find it on that website. So.
And I just posted that link in the Q&A in case anybody wanted to just have a clickable link. Yeah. And we had a question, let's see. So I lost it here, but I think I remember. Oh yeah, here, Lori had asked, she said that she's helped out with some of the Bigfoot night hikes. Yeah. I know that you mentioned them earlier. She was wondering if they're gonna start up anytime soon. So I'm guessing that it's whenever we're able to resume in-person programming, John?
Yeah, it is. That's as far as I know. I don't really, I'm kind of in the same boat. I don't really know. Whenever everything, slows down, we're able to start doing in-person programming again. Yeah. But hi, thanks for. We
have Ann. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We have Andy in London who said a lot of reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe quite violent attacks, whereas more recent reports are more benign. Do you think many early reports were embellished somewhat or sensationalized?
Yes, I do. Actually, and that's mentioned in that book that I told you about, the historical Bigfoot. Even back then, there were slow news days. So in order to sell papers, oftentimes they would be embellished with a kind of a violent Bigfoot. But you also have to take into consideration that maybe the encounters were also violent because during that early settlement period, we were kind of, we were clearing a lot of land, we were interacting with natives, and maybe not the nicest way possible. The European influence, that idea of manifest destiny pushing west, it caused some static. So it would be plausible that those early, more violent encounters were possibly because, it was between two species that didn't recognize and didn't know each other. And that's why that happened. And now we've got, a couple hundred years of coexisting together, and it's become a much more benign experience, for them at least. It's still pretty surprising to see a Bigfoot. Everyone that I've talked to, it's pretty surprising. So but there were certainly slow news days back then too, and I think much of the sort of violent wild man things were embellished. But there's also an element of that, might just be an unfamiliar species meeting another unfamiliar species. So. We don't know.
So we have Parker and Porter and Montana who asked, what is the most common seen Bigfoot? I don't know if you're able to answer that, but you talked about some different types from different locations.
Yeah. Well, certainly the Pacific Northwest has most of the sightings, and that's by far one of the more wild parts of the country still. The vast tracts of kind of uncut, untouched forest out there. That's so those are very common sightings. But here in Ohio, we're right up there as far as the most common, Bigfoot sightings in North America. And Texas is actually kind of right up there with us. Texas has a lot of Bigfoot sightings. So it kind of depends on your region what the most common Bigfoot sighting is. Most of them, I will say, as far as a scenario, a vast majority of Bigfoot sightings are actually roadway, kind of drive-by sightings where something runs across the road and the person slams on their brakes and has to stop and think, did I just see a Bigfoot? That's a really common Bigfoot sighting. And that's fascinating to me because the first time I saw a bobcat was driving by, something ran across the road, I slammed on my brakes and had to step by step walk backwards through my mind to figure out what I just saw because I couldn't place it. So, you know, it is by far the most common isn't, you know, a hiker out for a day hike. The most common is kind of this drive-by Bigfoot sighting. So that's the most common scenario, at least. I think probably the Pacific Northwest still holds the title of the most common Bigfoot sightings, though. So.
And we have a question asking about if you're aware of what the longest trackway that's been reported.
I am not aware of what the longest trackway is. However, those questions are very hard because depending on what resource you use, there might be some discrepancies between resources. You know, it's and that is. It's like with anything, it depends on the researcher that was involved with it and the research done prior to that. So I'm afraid that one is, I'm not sure about that one. I can't answer that one.
And we have Adelina who asked, what does a baby Bigfoot look like? Have there been any baby Bigfoot sightings?
There have been baby Bigfoot sightings. There's actually quite a few, and they do look like a miniature adult Bigfoot. You know, and it's interesting. Often baby Bigfoot sightings, they're spotted with their mother. They're not spotted alone. And often, you know, the baby's not spotted first. The adult's spotted first, and then in many reports, the creature bends over, picks up something off the ground, and puts it on top of its shoulders, kind of like you would carry, you know, a toddler, you know, with their legs over your shoulders. And then they walk off. So that, you know, that's been pretty common. People will talk about seeing an animal, they pick something up, they put this smaller creature on their shoulders and walk off. So there are reports of baby, you know, mothers with like a baby Bigfoot. So there are reports of that. They're out there.
Very cool. And then we have Diane who asked, are there more sightings in Salt Fork at certain times of the year?
Yeah, it actually seems like there's a little uptick right after the first of the year, kind of in the later winter months, which would make sense because there are fewer people here. So we see, I see bobcats, I see beavers, I see deer much more frequently in those late winter months because there are fewer people about, animals are moving more, and also food is becoming more scarce, so animals are having to kind of expand their range to find food. And there are no leaves on. The forest is kind of stark white, you know, and gray, and you can see further into the woods. The underbrush is all died off. So yeah, I think there after that late winter, early spring, there's always kind of an uptick in sightings here.
They probably can't camouflage as well as...
Right, probably can't camouflage as well. And then during the really busy months, you know, there might be sightings because there are so many people out here, so there are so many eyes out in the woods. But yeah, I think that here at Salt Fork, there's always a little uptick in sightings right after that first of the year, kind of February, March, you know, into the early spring. But the late winter time period, I think is probably there's a little uptick in sightings, or at least like substantiated reports. So.
And so we actually have Andy in London who commented, and he believes that the longest trackway may have been the London trackway in 2012, where there were over 100 footprints. So
cool. Okay.
Just wanted to add that comment. And we had another comment from an anonymous poster that said psychic Bigfoot aligns with some Native traditions and is even mentioned in the Native American Museum in DC.
Oh, great. Fascinating. Well, thanks. Yeah, that's cool. Excellent.
Yeah, so thanks to everyone who joined today. John, I don't know if you have more that you wanted to
No, this is perfect. This is perfect. So
all right. There's so much that we could we were just sorry, I stopped you right before your question slide. I didn't realize that.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Here's my contact information.
There's so much to talk about.
If anybody has anything specific you'd like to ask, and hopefully I can answer it. If you do ask me, hopefully I can send the question to one of my Bigfoot researcher friends, and they can answer it maybe better than I can. But thanks, everyone. I hope you have a happy October.
And I am going to copy your email address. It's a little hard to see on the slide, so I'm going to put it in the Q&A box there in case anybody wanted to reach you, John.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks, John, and thanks Rochelle in the background for helping with questions. We had a ton of great questions come in today. This was a fun one. So I hope you all enjoy your Halloween. Just a heads up, we're doing a series next month with our Division of Wildlife, our wildlife officers. So we're going to be talking about what it takes to become a wildlife officer. We're going to go into some investigations, such as a ginseng investigation. And we're going to talk about our canine units and wildlife calls. So I hope you can join us next month with our Division of Wildlife for that series. Once again, thanks for joining us and happy Halloween.